In 1891, a 12-year-old black boy found himself on death row for a crime he never committed. Yet within those prison walls, something beyond explanation began to unfold. Men on the brink of death started recovering. Wounds would seal themselves shut by morning. The guards soon realized they were housing someone capable of performing miracles. This is the authentic account of John Duncan, a boy who could heal nearly everything except the deep-seated hatred in people's hearts. It was March 1891 in Yazoo County, Mississippi, when they came for young John Duncan, barely 12 years old. A quiet child, noticeably small for his years, he had gentle eyes and soft hands. The entire black community of Cypress Landing knew him well. He'd carry water for the elderly. Every Sunday, his voice would rise in song at church. Trouble was never something he sought out. Yet none of that mattered once two white girls were discovered dead near the cotton fields. Before we proceed with this remarkable narrative, remember to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments which city you're tuning in from. We appreciate it. Now, let's return to the story. The sheriff discovered John seated beneath an aged oak tree, tears streaming down his face. Soil dirtied his hands. The two girls lay nearby on the ground, wildflowers delicately arranged in their small hands. Dried blood stained their white dresses. John attempted to explain himself. He'd discovered them that way, already lifeless, he said. He'd attempted to assist them, to rouse them. Sheriff Morton, however, wasn't interested in explanations. A black boy alone with two deceased white girls was all the evidence he required. They bound John's wrists and ankles with chains, clearly designed for grown men, far too large for him. As he walked, the chains dragged along the ground. His mother's screams filled the air as she fell to her knees in the dirt, pleading desperately. His father attempted to step forward, only to be forcefully pushed back by two deputies. The entire community stood in heavy silence, watching John being loaded onto a wagon. No one could intervene. No one dared try. The journey to Parchman Prison consumed 3 full days. John sat in that wagon, hands restrained, eyes fixed on the sky above. Confusion clouded his understanding of what was happening. His thoughts kept returning to those two girls, how he'd found them in those woods, how he'd knelt to help. He'd touched their faces, felt their coldness, wept over them. Now everyone believed he was their killer. The wagon rolled past small towns and endless cotton fields stretching to the horizon. White onlookers would pause and stare as they passed. Some pointed fingers, some spat. John heard the names they hurled at him, words he'd heard before, but never truly understood the venom behind until this moment. Nightfall brought chains binding him to trees, while the sheriff and deputies made camp nearby. John would lie on the rough ground, gazing at stars, wondering if he'd ever see his family again. On day 2, they stopped at a small settlement for supplies. A crowd gathered around the wagon, men in soiled work clothes, women in lengthy dresses, children no older than John himself. All came to glimpse the boy accused of killing white girls. A rock struck John's shoulder, thrown by someone in the crowd. Rotten fruit followed. Sheriff Morton had to discharge his weapon into the air to disperse them, but John had already seen the hatred in their eyes. In that moment, he understood his fate was sealed. The hanging would merely be a formality. Upon arrival at Parchman, the guards seemed taken aback. They'd anticipated a man, not this child. The prison was notoriously brutal, designed to contain Mississippi's worst offenders. It functioned as an enormous farm where inmates worked fields in chains, their backs breaking beneath the relentless sun. Death Row occupied a separate long building with cramped cells where men awaited execution. Deputy Warden Thomas Mitchell became the first person to genuinely observe John. At 45, Mitchell was tall with graying hair and weary eyes. 15 years at Parchman had convinced him he'd witnessed everything imaginable. Yet when they brought chained John Duncan into his office, something clenched in Mitchell's chest. Before him sat a child. A frightened, bewildered child who belonged playing with friends, not sitting in chains awaiting death. Mitchell slowly reviewed the charges, somehow hoping they'd transform as he read. Murder of 2 white girls, ages 9 and 7. The evidence appeared straightforward and condemning. John discovered with the bodies. Blood on his hands. No other suspects considered. The trial hadn't even lasted 2 hours. The all-white jury deliberated merely 10 minutes before reaching their verdict. Guilty. Sentencing death by hanging, scheduled for June 15, 1891. Those first days, John spoke little. They placed him in a cell at death row's far end, separated from adult prisoners. 6 by 8 feet, containing only a metal cot, a waste bucket, and bare stone walls that remained cold and damp despite the warming spring air. One barred window sat high, too high for John to see through. Night brought sounds of other prisoners talking, cursing, weeping. Some screamed in their sleep. The constant noise of chains dragging on concrete never ceased. 7 other men occupied death row, mostly white. They'd killed in bar brawls, robbed and murdered travelers, or committed worse atrocities. Initially, the new arrival drew little attention. But discovering it was a child, a black child at that, prompted some to call out, asking questions, making jokes. Some showed cruelty, others simple curiosity. An elderly man named Henry Walsh, awaiting execution for killing his business partner, instructed the others to leave the boy undisturbed. Walsh had grandchildren near John's age. Mitchell assigned guard Paul Hendricks to oversee death row. Hendricks was a hardened 38-year-old with scarred knuckles and a rarely smiling face. Barroom and back alley fights had occupied much of his life. Growing up rough had taught him early that nothing came free in this world. He didn't particularly enjoy his job, but it paid better than fieldwork and kept him out of the sun. When Mitchell informed him about the boy, Hendricks merely shrugged. He didn't care who occupied cells as long as they remained quiet and trouble-free. Yet Hendricks found himself observing John more than expected. The boy appeared so small inside that cell. He'd sit on his cot, knees drawn tight to his chest, arms wrapped around his legs, staring vacantly. Sometimes Hendricks would catch him singing softly. Old church songs Hendricks recognized from his own childhood, before life had beaten religion out of him. The boy's voice carried sweet and clear, echoing off stone walls in a way that made even the most hardened prisoners pause and listen. Almost immediately after John's arrival, inexplicable things started happening. 3 days in, prisoner Samuel Cross began screaming in his cell. Cross was a 40-year-old white man awaiting execution for killing a store owner during a robbery. Weeks of unbroken fever had plagued him. The prison doctor, Old Foster, a barely competent drunk, suggested pneumonia and offered little hope. In 1891, pneumonia typically meant death. That night, Cross's screams grew so intense that Hendricks went to investigate. The man burned with fever, shaking violently, barely breathing. His pale skin was slick with sweat, eyes rolled back. Hendricks assumed he'd be dead by morning. Perhaps that would be mercy, better than hanging. Walking past John's cell on his return, he found the boy standing at the bars, watching with those large, sorrowful eyes. His small hands gripped the metal tightly. Hendricks paused. "What are you staring at, boy?" John didn't answer immediately. Then softly, "That man is really sick. He's scared." Hendricks grunted. "Yeah, well, he's dying." Nothing to be done. John kept gazing toward Cross's cell. "Maybe there is." He whispered so quietly Hendricks almost missed it. The next morning, Samuel Cross sat upright in bed, consuming the terrible prison breakfast like a feast. His fever had vanished. Breathing normal. color restored. He claimed to feel better than he had in months. Actually, better than he'd felt in years. Joint pain that had plagued him for a decade was gone. The constant headache he'd lived with had disappeared. He felt strong, clear, renewed. The prison doctor examined him thoroughly and found nothing wrong. It was as if the illness had never existed. Foster scratched his head, muttered about miracles, and checked Cross 3 additional times to be certain. Word spread among prisoners. Some suggested Cross had been faking, never truly that ill. But Hendricks had witnessed him. The man had been dying. No question about it. Hendricks attributed it to luck initially. People sometimes recovered spontaneously. The body was strange and unpredictable. He'd seen men survive impossible things and others die from seemingly minor wounds. Then it happened again. A week later, prisoner James Wilson severely cut his hand on a piece of metal he'd been shaping. Prisoners weren't supposed to possess metal, but they always found ways. The wound was deep, bleeding heavily down to the bone. The doctor stitched it with thick black thread, but predicted infection. Back then, infections killed frequently. Without antibiotics or real medicine, a serious cut could mean death, especially in a dirty place like prison. Wilson's cell was 2 down from John's. That night, Hendricks heard Wilson groaning in pain. He found the man clutching his bandaged hand, rocking back and forth. The bandage was already blood-soaked. Hendricks provided whiskey for the pain and left. Returning an hour later, he found John at his cell bars, staring toward Wilson. His small hands gripped the metal so tightly his knuckles were white. Sweat stood on the boy's forehead despite the cool night. The next morning, Wilson unwrapped his bandage to change it. The wound had healed. Not healing, healed completely. The stitches remained, but surrounding skin was pink and new, as if the cut had occurred weeks earlier instead of yesterday. Wilson showed everyone who would look, holding his hand up to the bars. The prison doctor examined it carefully and had no explanation. His report noted he must have misjudged the wound's depth, but Hendricks had seen it. He knew how severe it was. Hendricks began noticing a pattern. Whenever someone on death row became sick or injured, they recovered. And each time, that boy John stood at his bars watching, or sometimes lay on his cot, with eyes closed and hands pressed together as if praying. A prisoner suffering months of agony from a rotten tooth awoke pain, free one morning. The tooth had somehow healed itself. A man plagued by terrible stomach cramps suddenly felt fine. A guard who badly twisted his ankle on stairs could walk normally the next day. All this began after John Duncan's arrival. Mitchell noticed too. A careful man trained to recognize patterns, he started documenting every incident in a leather notebook locked in his desk. Prisoner names, their conditions, recovery times, and whether John had been nearby. The pattern became impossible to dismiss. One night, well past midnight, Mitchell visited death row alone. Most prisoners slept. Only snoring and occasional coughs broke the silence. His boots echoed on stone as he approached John's cell. He found the boy on his cot, knees pulled up, staring at the wall. John looked up at approaching footsteps, his eyes red as if he'd been crying. Mitchell pulled up a stool and sat outside the bars. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Mitchell asked directly, keeping his voice low, "Son, are you doing something to these men? Are you helping them somehow?" John didn't respond immediately. He looked down at his hands, turning them over slowly, studying his palms as if they belonged to someone else. Then he nodded once. Mitchell felt his heart quicken. He'd suspected, but confirmation made it real. "How? How are you doing it?" John's voice was so quiet Mitchell had to lean closer. "I don't know how, sir. It just happens. When someone's hurting real bad, I can feel it. Like their hurt is inside me too. And if I think about them hard enough, If I really want them to be okay, sometimes the hurt goes away. It moves from them to me, and then it just disappears. Mitchell asked if it hurt John when he did this. The boy nodded again, more firmly. Yes, sir. It feels like their pain moves into me for a little while. Sometimes it's real bad, like burning or being cut, then it fades away slow. But I get real tired after. Real tired, like I've been working in the fields all day. He paused, then added, My mama always said I had a gift. She made me promise not to tell nobody. Said people wouldn't understand. They would be afraid, or they would use me. Mitchell sat there for a long while, gazing at this child who could accomplish impossible things. His mind raced with questions, doubts, wonder. Finally, he asked John what truly happened that day in the woods with the two girls. John's eyes filled with tears that spilled down his cheeks. He explained he was walking home after helping Mrs. Patterson with her garden. She was an elderly woman living alone, and John assisted with weeds and water twice weekly. Late afternoon, the sun lowering, he heard crying in the woods and went to investigate. He discovered the two girls lying in a small clearing, bleeding from chest wounds. Their eyes were open but unseeing. He ran to them, knelt, tried using his gift to heal them as he'd healed others. But they were already gone. He'd arrived too late. The gift didn't work on the deceased. He tried so hard, concentrating until his head hurt, until his nose bled, but nothing happened. They'd remained cold and still. He'd wept over them, these two little girls he didn't even know. He'd placed wildflowers in their hands because it seemed respectful. That's when Sheriff Morton found him. John said he'd possessed the gift as long as he could remember. When he was perhaps 5, his grandmother became ill with a persistent cough. She grew weaker until barely able to leave bed. John had climbed beside her one night, held her hand, wishing intensely for her recovery, praying to God for help. The next morning, she was fine. The cough gone. She rose and prepared breakfast as if nothing had happened. His mother witnessed it again when John was 7. A neighbor's dog was hit by a wagon, its leg badly broken. Everyone said it would need to be shot. But John touched the dog, and the next day it ran around normally. After that, his mother sat him down and made him promise secrecy. She said people wouldn't understand. They'd think him strange or dangerous, or worse, they'd use him, work him like a mule until nothing remained. So John kept his secret, only using his gift when unobserved, helping without drawing attention. But that day in the woods, he panicked. He tried so hard to revive those girls that he didn't hear the sheriff approaching. Didn't realize how incriminating it looked. A black boy kneeling over 2 dead white girls with blood on his hands. By the time he understood what they thought he'd done, the chains were already on him, and no one would listen to his explanation. No one wanted the truth. Mitchell believed him. He couldn't precisely explain why, but he did. Perhaps because he'd witnessed too much with his own eyes to deny it. Perhaps because no child could lie so convincingly with such pain in his voice. Or perhaps Mitchell was simply wary of a world where a boy like this could be condemned to death for his skin color and unfortunate circumstances. Whatever the reason, he believed John Duncan was innocent. But believing and proving were entirely different matters. In 1891 Mississippi, a black child accused of killing white children had no chance. Courts didn't care about evidence, truth, or justice. They cared about keeping white people satisfied and black people afraid. The system was built specifically to destroy people like John Duncan. Word about John's gift began spreading through the prison. Initially just whispers, prisoners talking quietly through walls at night when guards weren't attentive. But soon everyone knew. The death row men, night shift guards, prisoners in general population who heard stories during meals or work details. Some prisoners started directly requesting John's help, calling out through walls. Men with old injuries that never healed properly. Men with sicknesses the doctor couldn't or wouldn't treat. Men who simply hurt constantly from years of hard labor and harder living. Hendricks told Mitchell they needed to stop it. If word escaped the prison walls, trouble would follow. People would either think they were fabricating miracles to make the prison look good, or worse, they'd believe and want to exploit the boy. Rich people would come demanding healing for themselves and families. Poor people would come begging. The church might become involved, calling John a saint or demon depending on perspective. It would become a circus. Mitchell agreed, but didn't know how to stop something that happened without planning. He couldn't imprison John more than he already was. He couldn't prevent people from becoming sick or injured. And he couldn't bring himself to tell John to stop helping. Not when the boy seemed to need it, as if it were the only thing giving his life meaning. Then another guard, Robert Clay, approached Mitchell with an idea. Clay differed from most parchment guards. Educated, 2 years of college before money ran out. He read books. He contemplated things. Quiet and serious. Other guards found him strange. Clay suggested if John truly possessed this gift, if he could genuinely heal people, they should properly test it. Bring someone truly dying and see if John could help. If successful, perhaps they could prove John was special. Maybe secure a new trial, get influential people interested in his case. Perhaps save his life. Mitchell disliked the idea. It felt wrong using a child's gift that way. It felt like they'd be no better than the people his mother warned about, those who would work him like a mule. But he also recognized it might be John's only chance. The execution date loomed just 3 months away, June 15th. Without something dramatic, undeniable, attention, grabbing, John Duncan would hang. They'd place a noose around a 12-year-old boy's neck and drop him through a trap door. And that would be the end. They decided to bring Clay's own father. Martin Clay was 68 and dying of cancer. Doctors had given up months ago. The stomach tumor was consuming him from within. He couldn't eat solid food anymore, could barely drink water without vomiting. The pain was so severe, he spent most days in a chair by the window, too exhausted even to read the Bible in his lap. His son Robert had watched him waste away, growing thinner and weaker, life-draining day by day. The doctor gave him perhaps a month, probably less. Robert Clay asked his father if he'd be willing to see the boy, to let John try to help him. Martin agreed without hesitation. He had nothing to lose. He was already dying. They brought Martin Clay to the prison on a Sunday morning in early May. It took 2 men to help him walk from the wagon to the warden's office. His skin had a yellowish tint. His eyes were deeply sunken. He weighed perhaps 90 pounds, all bones and loose skin. They carefully placed him in a padded chair and brought John in. John looked at the old man, and immediately his eyes grew wet with tears. He could feel the pain radiating from Martin Clay, like heat from a fire on a cold night. It was overwhelming, a constant burning agony filling every part of the old man's body. Without being told, without asking permission, John walked over slowly and placed his small hands on Martin's stomach, exactly where Robert indicated the tumor was. Martin gasped at the touch. He later described it as feeling like ice water and hot fire simultaneously, spreading through his body from where the boy's hands rested. John closed his eyes tightly. His hands began shaking. Sweat broke out on his forehead and ran down his face. His breathing became fast and shallow. Everyone in the room watched in complete silence. Mitchell stood by the door. Robert Clay stood behind his father's chair. Hendricks was there too, along with 2 other guards who'd come to witness for themselves. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sounds were the old man's breathing and a soft humming seeming to come from John himself. After about 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, John suddenly pulled his hands away and stumbled backward. Mitchell caught him before he fell. The boy was pale as milk, breathing hard, looking like he might pass out or vomit or both. Mitchell helped him to a chair and made him sit. John's nose was bleeding, a thin line of red running over his lip. His hands shook so badly he couldn't hold them still. Martin Clay sat very still for a moment, his eyes wide. Then he took a deep breath, deeper than he'd managed in months. He placed his hand on his stomach, pressing gently where the tumor had been. The constant, terrible pain that had lived there so long was gone. Simply gone, as if it had never existed. He looked at his son with tears running down his face. "Robert," he whispered, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. "It doesn't hurt anymore, Robert. It doesn't hurt." Over the following week, Martin Clay grew stronger. Not all at once, but steadily and surely. He started eating again. Small amounts initially, then more. The yellow color left his skin. He could walk without assistance. He spent time in his garden again, something he thought he'd never do. When his doctor examined him 2 weeks later, the man was speechless. He checked Martin 3 times, unable to believe what he was seeing. The tumor was smaller, much smaller. A month after that, when the doctor checked again, it was completely gone, vanished. The doctor called it a spontaneous remission, extremely rare but medically documented in a few historical cases. But Martin Clay knew the truth. That boy had saved his life. That boy had given him back his future. Robert Clay became John's most devoted defender after that. With the determination of a lawyer building a case, he started gathering evidence. He talked to people in Cypress Landing, John's home community. He found witnesses who remembered seeing John at Mrs. Patterson's house that afternoon. He found Mrs. Patterson herself, who confirmed John had helped in her garden and left just before the girls were killed. He discovered the 2 girls had been seen with a white man earlier that day. A drifter working odd jobs around the county. Several people remembered him because he was strange and unfriendly, making people uncomfortable. That man had left town the day after the girls died, and no one knew where he went. Clay wrote letters to lawyers in Jackson, Memphis, New Orleans. He wrote to newspapers trying to interest them in the story. He wrote to ministers and church leaders, thinking they might care about a boy who could heal. He even wrote to the governor, though he expected nothing from that. He used his own limited money to pay a private investigator to track the drifter. He did everything he could think of to build a case for John's innocence, to give him a chance. But the system didn't want to listen. The local judge refused to reopen the case. The trial was fair, the verdict final, he said. Newspapers wouldn't print stories defending a black boy accused of killing white children. Most didn't even respond to Clay's letters. The few that did responded that it wasn't news, wasn't appropriate, or they had no space. The lawyers Clay contacted said there was nothing they could do. The case was closed. Some were honest, telling him straight that even if John was innocent, even if he could perform miracles and raise the dead, it wouldn't matter. The people wanted someone to hang for those dead girls. And John Duncan was who they'd chosen. That was how justice worked in Mississippi. That was how it had always worked. As spring turned to summer, more people started coming to see John. Despite Mitchell's efforts to keep it quiet, guards brought sick family members. A few prisoners about to be released told their families about the boy. Word spread through surrounding counties. Soon Mitchell had to turn people away almost daily. People showed up at prison gates asking to see the miracle boy. Some offered money, some begged, some demanded, claiming it was their right as taxpayers, Christians, or human beings. Keeping it secret was becoming impossible. The John helped everyone they brought to him. A woman with terrible arthritis, who hadn't used her hands in years, came in crying from pain and left crying from joy, flexing fingers that worked like new. A child with a twisted leg who'd never walked without crutches learned to walk straight and strong. A man going blind from cataracts, who could barely see light and shadow, could suddenly see clearly, see his wife's face for the first time in years. Each healing left John weaker, more tired, his small body taking on damage it wasn't meant to carry. But he never said no. He never refused. Mitchell noticed the boy was getting thinner, the dark circles under his eyes growing deeper and darker. Hendricks, the hard guard who never cared much, who'd spent his life looking out only for himself, started bringing John extra food. Bread from his own table, an apple or piece of chicken saved from his dinner. He would sit outside the cell at night, long after his shift ended, and talk to the boy. Initially, John didn't talk much, just listened while Hendricks told stories about his life. Growing up poor and mean, all the stupid things he'd done. But slowly John started opening up too. He told Hendricks about his life before all this happened. About his parents, his father who worked at the mill and his mother who took in washing. About his little sister Ruby who was only 7 and loved to sing. About going fishing in the creek with his father on Sunday afternoons. The water cool and clear and full of small fish flashing silver in the sun. About helping his mother hang laundry and listening to her hum old songs. About playing with other children, running through the woods, climbing trees, normal things that seemed like they happened 100 years ago, instead of just a few months. John told him about church, how he loved the singing most of all, how the whole community would gather on Sunday mornings in the small wooden church that smelled like pine and old hymn books, how the music would rise up and fill the space, all those voices joining together. And for a while, everything felt right and good and safe. He said he missed that most, the singing, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. One night, Hendricks asked John why he kept helping people when it hurt him so much, when it made him so tired and weak. John thought about it for a long time, sitting there in his cell with his knees pulled up. Then, he said it was because he could, because God or nature or something gave him this gift. And if he didn't use it to help people, what was the point? What was the point of having it at all? He said being able to take away someone's pain, even for a little while, even if it cost him something, was worth it. It made him feel like his life mattered, like he was here for a reason. Hendricks, who'd spent his whole life being hard and not caring about anyone, who'd built walls around his heart so high nothing could get through, felt something break inside him when John said that. This child, this tiny 12-year-old boy who'd been wrongly accused and imprisoned and sentenced to death, who had every reason to be angry and bitter and hateful, had more goodness in his small body than Hendricks had in his entire life. And they were going to kill him. They were going to put a rope around his neck and drop him through a floor and kill him for something he didn't do. June came hot and heavy. The Mississippi summer settled over Parchman like a wet blanket. The prison felt like an oven during the day, the stone walls holding in heat until you could barely breathe. At night, it barely cooled down. Just went from unbearable to merely miserable. The prisoners suffered. The guards suffered. Everyone suffered except maybe the mosquitoes that came in clouds from the swamps. John's execution was scheduled for June 15th at dawn. As the date got closer, Mitchell became desperate. He worked less and less, spent more and more time in his office writing letters, sending telegrams, trying everything he could think of to save this boy's life. He sent telegrams to the governor, to state representatives, to anyone with power or influence. He tried to get church leaders involved, thinking they might care about justice or mercy. He contacted newspapers in other states, hoping they would see the story as worth printing. He even considered helping John escape, though he knew that was impossible. A black child on the run in Mississippi wouldn't last a day. They would find him and probably kill him on the spot, and that would be that. At least now John was alive. At least he had a few more days. Robert Clay was at the prison almost every day now. He had left his job to focus on saving John full-time. His wife thought he was crazy, spending their savings on a lost cause, but she didn't try to stop him. Clay's father, Martin, came with him sometimes, still strong and healthy, living proof of what John could do. They would sit with John, talk to him, try to keep his spirits up. But even they could see the boy was fading. The healings were taking more and more out of him. He was so thin now his bones showed through his skin. His eyes seemed too large for his face. The night before the execution, something happened that changed everything. One of the guards, a young man named Billy Porter, was working the night shift. Porter was only 22, new to the job, still trying to prove himself to the older guards. He was walking past the cells around midnight, checking on the prisoners like he was supposed to, when he heard a sound from the direction of the warden's office. It was late, way past midnight, and nobody should have been there. The warden had gone home hours ago. Mitchell usually left by 10:00. Porter went to investigate, his hand on the club at his belt. He walked slowly down the corridor toward the office, listening. He heard voices, angry and raised. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear the emotion. When he got to the office door, which was slightly open, he peeked through. Inside, he saw Deputy Warden Mitchell sitting at his desk. Standing in front of the desk was Robert Clay, and he was holding a gun. Porter froze, not sure what to do. He heard Clay shouting at Mitchell, saying he had to help John escape, that it was the only way. Mitchell was shaking his head, saying it was impossible. They would both hang for it and John wouldn't get 10 miles before they caught him. Clay was crying, waving the gun around. He said he didn't care anymore, that he couldn't stand by and watch them kill an innocent child, that he would rather die trying to save him than live knowing he didn't try. Porter should have gone for help. That's what he was trained to do. But he was young and scared and didn't know what to do. He stood there frozen, watching through the crack in the door. He saw Clay and Mitchell arguing, saw Mitchell stand up and try to reach for the gun. They struggled and then the gun went off. The sound was impossibly loud in the small office. Mitchell fell back into his chair, blood spreading across his chest. Clay stood there staring at the gun in his hand, like he couldn't believe what just happened. Then he dropped it and ran, pushing past Porter in the doorway and disappearing into the night. Porter stood there for a few seconds in shock. Then he started shouting for help. Guards came running from all directions. They found Mitchell slumped over his desk, bleeding badly. He had been shot once in the chest just left of center. The blood was dark and coming fast. Porter tried to explain what happened, the words tumbling out. Someone ran to get the prison doctor. Someone else organized a search party to find Clay. But everyone could see Mitchell was in bad shape. Real bad. They brought Mitchell down to the prison doctor's office. 4 men carrying him as gently as they could. The doctor, old Foster, with his shaking hands and whiskey breath, took one look at the wound and shook his head. The bullet had gone through Mitchell's lung. He was drowning in his own blood, choking on it. His breathing was wet and rattling. His skin was turning gray. Foster said there was nothing he could do. Mitchell would be dead within the hour, maybe less. The nearest real hospital was 2 days away by horse and wagon. There was no time. There was nothing anyone could do. Hendricks stood there watching his boss and friend dying, blood bubbling from his lips with each shallow breath, and suddenly he knew what had to be done. He didn't think about it, didn't plan it, just acted. He ran down to death row, his boots pounding on the stone floor. He grabbed the keys from the wall and unlocked John's cell. John was awake, sitting on his cot, looking scared. He had heard the gunshot, heard the shouting. Hendricks grabbed the boy's arm and pulled him up. "Come with me now." John didn't ask questions, just followed as Hendricks dragged him through the corridors back to the doctor's office. The other guards tried to stop them, asking what Hendricks was doing, but he pushed through them. He didn't care anymore about rules or consequences. He had spent his whole life following rules, and where had it got him? Nowhere good. He brought John into the room where Mitchell lay dying. Mitchell's eyes were half closed, his breathing rattling and wet with blood. There was so much blood on his shirt, on the table, on the floor. Hendricks practically threw John toward the table. "Help him," Hendricks said, his voice breaking. "Please, son, he's a good man. He tried to help you. He's been trying to save you. Please." John looked at the dying man, and his eyes went wide. He could feel the damage inside Mitchell's body, could feel the torn lung and the blood filling up his chest, and the heart struggling to keep beating. It was bad, worse than anything he had tried to heal before. But he didn't hesitate. He climbed up on a stool so he could reach better, and placed both his small hands over the wound on Mitchell's chest. Blood soaked through his fingers, warm and sticky. He closed his eyes and concentrated harder than he ever had before. Everyone in the room watched in silence as the boy's hands began to glow with a soft blue light. At first, it was so faint they thought they were imagining it, that it was just the lamplight playing tricks. But it got brighter, pulsing in rhythm with Mitchell's failing heartbeat. The light grew and grew, casting strange shadows on the walls, turning everything in the room blue and cold and beautiful. John started to shake violently. His nose began to bleed, thin lines of red running down over his lips and chin. He made a sound deep in his throat, half cry and half moan. But he didn't stop. He kept his hands pressed to Mitchell's chest, even as his own body trembled and shook. The light got brighter and brighter, so bright that everyone had to look away to shield their eyes. It filled the room like lightning, like the sun itself was shining through that boy's hands. Then suddenly it stopped. The light vanished like someone blew out a candle. John collapsed, his small body crumpling like paper. He fell off the stool and hit the floor hard. Hendricks caught him, rolled him over. The boy's eyes were open, but not seeing anything, staring at nothing. Blood ran from his nose and ears, staining Hendricks' shirt. His breathing was shallow and fast like a bird's. When Hendricks picked him up, the boy felt like he weighed nothing at all, like he was made of paper and air and light instead of flesh and bone. Everyone rushed to Mitchell. He took a deep breath, then another, clear and strong. The wet rattling was gone. The blood stopped flowing from the wound. Someone opened his shirt to look and gasp. Where the bullet hole had been, there was only pink new skin. The bullet itself had been pushed out somehow, lying on the table in a pool of blood. Mitchell's eyes opened fully. He looked around confused, touching his chest. "What happened?" he asked. His voice was steady and strong. "I feel fine. I feel good." But John didn't move. They carried the boy back to his cell and laid him on the cot as gently as they could. The doctor tried to examine him, but didn't know what was wrong. There were no visible injuries, except the blood from his nose and ears. His heartbeat was weak and irregular. His skin was cold as ice. His eyes were open but seeing nothing. It was like he was fading away from the inside, piece by piece, like a candle burning down to nothing. Mitchell, fully healed now like he had never been shot, sat beside John's cot and held the boy's small, cold hand. He was crying, tears running down his face into his beard. "What did I do?" he kept saying over and over. "What did I do to him? He saved me and I killed him. What did I do?" John opened his eyes once. Several hours later. The sun was starting to come up, pink light filtering through the high window. He looked at Mitchell and smiled just a little, his lips barely moving. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice so faint Mitchell had to lean down close to hear. "You're a good man. You tried to help me. I know you tried. It's okay." Then his eyes closed again, and he didn't open them for a long time. Dawn came on June 15th, the day John was supposed to hang. But instead of preparing an execution, the guards stood around his cell, watching a child die slowly. Mitchell sent word to cancel everything. He told them to dismantle the gallows, to send the witnesses home. He didn't care anymore about orders, or the law, or what people would say. If they wanted to fire him, let them. If they wanted to charge him, fine. He wasn't going to let this boy's last hours be spent preparing to kill him. They caught Robert Clay, trying to board a train in Jackson, trying to leave the state. The local sheriff brought him